this week we're going to wrap up this coffee table build, and that's just an effort to try to keep the series sort of reasonably short. I feel bad that it already took 4 videos, and then in an effort to keep this video shorter than the Titanic, I'm really just going to focus on the highlights. So everything like finishing and sanding, I'm going to skip over because I just think that that kind of stuff is boring. Basically, we're focusing on the tabletop at this point. So that's going to be figuring out these rounded corners, figuring out the frames for those rounded corners, and then also figuring out how to attach that tabletop to our base. The 2 key design elements as it relates to the tabletop are these curved corners and then also a frame that goes around the entire tabletop. I want to lead by saying that if I had this to do over again, I would take a totally different approach to it. The frame ended up not feeling really sturdy, and I had to go back and shore it up a little bit after the fact, and it just didn't come out as clean as I had wanted it. So, as I might have said before, curves complicate everything. If you're trying to frame something that's at 90 degrees, you just do a couple of miters, easy peasy, you're done. But I needed to essentially bend the wood around the curve. And there's a couple of ways I could have done this. I could have cut a curved shaped piece out of a piece of wood. But if I had done that, there would have been some end grain exposed there, mating into that long grain. Given that this was such a visible piece of the table, I didn't really like that idea. So I decided that I was going to do a bent lamination, which means I'm going to cut a bunch of thin pieces of wood and use a bending form to glue them into a curve. And I don't do this often enough that I've really like mastered this technique. And I just figured, there's one way to Carnegie Hall, and that's practice. So I decided that I was going to go ahead and try it on this table. What you're watching me do here is set up my bandsaw for resawing. So I went ahead and resawed these pieces of wood, and I definitely cut more strips than necessary. I was anticipating that I was going to have some breakage, that I might have to even rebend an entire corner if something goes completely wrong. So I definitely was sure to make more than enough pieces. Once I had these pieces resawed, I was sure to keep them in order so that, what started as one piece of wood, all those smaller pieces remained together and in order. Then I marked their edge before I sent them through the drum sander so that way I could put them back in order, all with the hopes once I bent these things that they would still look like one solid piece of wood. And then once that was done, I just set them in a bucket of water to soak overnight. Then I needed to reconfigure my bandsaw for normal operations. So that's just going to be the opposite of what I just did, taking out my resaw blade and putting in a standard blade. Just a couple of tips for doing this kind of stuff. I recommend wearing some nice thick gloves, otherwise you will cut your hands on that band. The other thing is they kind of fold up like those car visor things. So it's easiest to roll them back up by just sticking your foot in the bottom of it and then twisting it with your hand. Once that was all squared away, I went to go make my templates for my bending forms. So there's 3 relevant radii when it comes to the corners of this tabletop. There's the radius of the tabletop itself, and then there's the inner and the outer radius of the trim piece. And I need the trim, I'm going to run a dado through this, so I need the trim to overhang the tabletop some. I decided to make the trim about 5 pieces thick. So to get the outer radius, I took the template for my tabletop and then grabbed 2 pieces of the thin wood and just used that as a scribe to get the curve of that line. Then I took that over the bandsaw and cut it out. Then to make the inner template for my bending form, I took that inner scrap of wood, retraced the corner template for the tabletop, and then took 3 pieces of the thin wood and traced the straight lines. And then to get that curve equidistant, I grabbed my compass and then just used my compass to trace that curve, getting a nice even distance around the curve. You can see here on the right is the template for the tabletop, and on the left are the template for the bending forms. And you can see how there's this gap here that fits the frame, and that when overlaid the tabletop should fall right in the middle of that frame. So once I route out the groove for it to fit in, it should sit in there right in the middle. Now that I had the templates worked out, I needed to make the actual clamping forms. And I made a couple of mistakes when it came to this. I had these glued up pieces of plywood left over, I think from when I made my corner clamping blocks. I'm not really sure, but they were sitting over there on my shelf and I had two of them. And I thought that they would be perfect to use for this purpose. But they were actually a little bit small. I would recommend making a clamping form that creates a piece at least a few inches bigger than you actually need it. The other mistake was that these were rectangular, and I think that they should have been a square. I had problems applying even pressure, especially on that diagonal, because it was rectangular instead of square. So I do think if I had made a square, it would have been much easier to get into the blocks. But regardless, this is what I had and this is what I used. And at the end of the day, it did work. And so at this point, you know the drill. I just traced my templates onto the clamping block. I cut it out of the bandsaw. Then I used double-sided tape to adhere the templates to them and routed them out. To help with clamping, I drilled out some holes along the bending form, and then I cut the corner of the bending form off so that I had a flat place to put my clamp. Once that was done, I wrapped everything in packing tape to prevent gluing my workpiece to the bending form. I decided before I tried gluing these things up that I wanted to pre-bend them. I was hoping to get some practice with the clamping situation to figure out what worked best. And then I was also hoping that these would dry so that it wouldn't interfere with the glue drying. You can add water to tight bond, and I don't think it impacts its strength, but it just increases its open time. But I did think it would just be better if these things weren't soaking wet before I started trying to glue them together. So with all that being said, I went ahead and got two corners in the clamping blocks. I will say too, this caused an unexpected delay. I really didn't anticipate that it would take days for the wood to dry and then days for the glue to dry in these bending forms, but it did. And so to get both sets done, this set me back about like 10 or 11 days. And it just so happened that when I was working on these corners, it happened to be like the 3 days this winter that it was cold and rainy. So that also slowed down the drying process. Chula was very distraught by the rain, and so she was in the shop a little bit extra those days. So I was quite worried once I took these out of the bending forms. The spring back was significant. They sprung back to almost flat as soon as I pulled the clamping forms off. Yeah, at this moment I was concerned that this wasn't going to work. Despite my hesitation, I decided to go ahead with the glue up. I just figured there was only one way to find out if it was going to work or not, and that was to do it. So other than, having to stick these in the form, the glue up is similar to anything else. I just put glue on the strips, stacked them together, and then used clamps to pull them into the form. So this was 4 or 5 days later, but you can see here when I pull this out of clamps that there is no spring back, and they held their shape. After a century had passed and I had all 4 of these things glued up, I took them to my bandsaw to just trim off the excess, like the part that hung out of the form that I wasn't going to need. And that was just because I knew I was going to flatten these by hand, and I figured why waste energy sanding wood that I wasn't going to need. So once I had them all trimmed up at the bandsaw, I took them over to my flattening jig, i.e. a board with sandpaper taped to it, and flattened one side. And then to get the other side flat and parallel, and I went ahead and hot glued it to a flat sled and just sent them through my drum sander. And I opted for my drum sander here because I didn't think that the planer would treat these things kindly. And then it didn't feel great like trying to do this at the table saw. And then I considered my bandsaw, but I figured it was going to give a rough enough cut that I was going to need to do some sort of hand sanding again. So I just skipped all of that and went straight to the drum sander. So what I think I'm going to work on now is how I'm going to attach the tabletop to the base. And I probably should have thought about this before I started the project, but I did not. So you have a few options here. They have like some mounting plates that work really well from, I think it's called like Jeff Max Supply. You can use C channel, which is also very convenient. But you can also just use a type of like a skirt and some tabletop fasteners, which is how I go most of the time. Generally, I try to use as little hardware as possible. I'm not dogmatic about that. Like, I am not going to abandon drawer slides for traditional drawers because they just perform better. And I mean, so anyways, that's kind of my philosophy. But so I think all I'm gonna do is create a stretcher for up here. This is also going to help stabilize these legs. And I think I'm just going to use that with tabletop fasteners to lock this thing down. So I need to mill that up. I didn't mill wood for that, so I need to do that. And then I will figure out the joinery about how I'm going to add that into this leg structure. So this is part of me milling up those stretchers. This is really boring stuff you've seen me do a million times. So the only reason I'm including this is I want y'all to notice how I've taken your advice and I take off my jacket now when I run things through my table saw. I want to take a moment to just point out this detail when I was cutting this stretcher. I didn't have the exact length yet because it's going to be slightly different than those other stretchers because those are inset into the legs. So when I took the measurement to cross cut here, I took the time to clamp everything up and use some square corner clamps and check the measurements on both sides. And I did this because if you have your legs slightly splayed or anything like that, then you're going to have a base that isn't nice and square and things are going to get wonky on you. Okay, so with joinery, a lot of your success is going to just be based on like keeping things organized and oriented correctly as you're moving things around. For this, I want this to be flush to this surface. So these are both going to be my reference surfaces. And so I need to think about that when I'm laying out for joinery with my domino. Most often, you run it something like this and, you know, do the joinery. So I need this part of the fence to be against my reference surfaces. So I will orient it this way when I am going to hollow out for the mortise on this piece. But for this piece, I need this to orient on the top. So I'm gonna actually, I put this little attachment that I have on here and I'm gonna need to orient it that way. I actually decided to do something slightly different. I decided to go with furniture bolts and threaded inserts. The reason I changed my mind is that since this is a coffee table, I imagine it's going to be picked up by its tabletop all the time. And so I just felt like, you know, threaded inserts and furniture bolts are going to be more secure than a tabletop fastener. So here all I'm doing is I'm going to route a slot that will fit the furniture bolt head, and then I'm going to route 3 through slots so that the bolt itself can, you know, attach to the tabletop. And I'm going to make those probably about 1 inch wide each so that the tabletop, as it expands and contracts, the bolts can kind of give and hopefully prevent the tabletop from cracking or doing anything like that. At this point, the base was pretty much finished. I just had to do the finish sanding and then the glue up. Once I had it glued up, I did put the tabletop on there and laid out for those slot locations so I could install the threaded inserts for the furniture bolts. But other than that, there was really nothing interesting about it at this point. Once I had those corners built, I could finalize the dimensions of the rest of the trim. So I just cut it to width at the table saw, and then I took it to my planer and planed it down till it was the same thickness as those corners. Okay, so the next thing I need to figure out is how to recess, like to cut a groove. These are something. Here we go. Probably something like this, right? I think I want it closer to the top because the top, yeah. Oh, I do need to figure that out. How much do I want over the top? Yeah, I think that's about right. Okay, so I need to like remove this section here, something like that, to accept the tabletop. And I need to do that on the, okay, so that's easy enough on these like side pieces, right? But how do you do that on this? And the only thing I can think is a router. And I bought this a long time ago. I don't even remember why, but it has all these different bearings and you can switch them out so that you can get the size of rabbit you need. But it's overall like a 2-inch bit. I'm not saying under the right circumstances that I wouldn't run something like this, you know, but it seems a little sus. I think I'm going to just go with the more comfortable option of running this one. The other thing that I'm a little bit worried about, so on these, actually, I think it's going to be a pretty stable process because it has this hook in it, but to run these up on edge like that, I can see it getting a little unwieldy. And what I actually think I'm going to do is use double-sided tape on this and tape them together. So I'm going to route the inside of this and then flip it around and route the other side of this one. And then that way I just have more stability for each of these pieces. I was so wrong about this. Running this router bit on these corner blocks was sketchy and it was so uncomfortable. And I also realized that I couldn't get the router bit high enough to cut the slot where I needed it, and it was just a mess. So I decided that I wasn't going to continue. And I took the straight pieces and did them at the table saw. I couldn't think of any power tool that could dado this inside radius. And so the only tool that I could kind of come up with that could sort of do the job was a chisel. And I'm not great with hand tools. I know enough to get by. So any opportunity to practice is probably good. I just used my marking gauge, scored my outside lines, and then I just used a chisel to chop away the inside. I probably didn't do it right. Like, I'm sure that there was some method I should have done to like hog out all of this waste, but eventually I did get it done. When it came to the actual inside curve part, I found that when I was getting close to done, it was helpful to turn my chisel over and work it on the bevel to prevent, going too deep. I didn't film this part because it was kind of like ad hoc. I was just figuring it out as I went. But I also built some like rigging underneath the frame. The frame isn't glued onto the tabletop because I had to allow for expansion and contraction. So I only glued it on the ends in the center, and then the edges are free floating from the table. And I just didn't like how wobbly that was. It didn't feel fitting to the table. It felt loose because it is loose. So once I came to that point, I realized I needed to put some sort of structure underneath to hold the frame in place that attached to the table in the center, but still allowed for the tabletop to expand and contract. And so that's, again, another reason I would approach this whole project differently if I was to do this over again. I thought the best way to mate the long straight pieces with these corner blocks was going to be a scarf joint. That was just going to give me more glue surface than a butt joint. And then I also thought that it would blend the seam a little bit better. So this is the point of the project where things just didn't feel like they were going great and I was pretty stressed out. And so that's where I was in this project when I was doing this glue up, and I at least had enough sense to not attempt the whole thing all at one time. I decided that since the short ends could sit snug to the tabletop, I was going to glue those first so that I could use the tabletop basically as a form. And I have these little stretchers in between the corners just to make sure that they don't close too tightly, that they stay at 90 degrees. So then I just put blue tape underneath the joints to make sure that it didn't glue to the tabletop. I used blue tape to try to align things as best as I could. And then I used spring clamps and then my band clamps to get pressure on it, since I didn't really have like a great place to put like an F clamp or something like that. Once I had the short ends glued up, I did all of my cleanup work. I sanded the tabletop, I sanded the inside of the frame, any joints that I had so far, and then I did the glue up on the long ends. And for this, the band clamp did not provide pressure in the right way. And so instead of using that, I just went with blue tape and I used CA glue to hold things in place while the wood glue was drying. So you can see here that these scarf joints didn't turn out perfectly. I had to do a lot of cleanup work to get them looking good, but sometimes that's just the way it goes. I had to do a little bit of hand sanding on the inside of the frame, and then of course I needed to clean up the tops and the bottoms and the outsides. I hadn't done that part yet because I knew after I glue up I was going to still have a ton of that kind of stuff to do anyway. At this point, the coffee table is pretty much finished. After this, I did put finish on, and then I got my photographer out here to take pictures. I'm still waiting to get those back, and then when I do, I will get those put up into a post. But anyways, for those of you guys following along, I really appreciate you watching, and then I will be starting my next project soon.